Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. We're into February, slowly the season is starting to kick into gear and spring is in the air. Stay tuned in the coming weeks as we get updates on the salmon rivers and lochs around Ireland, and we'll be bringing you more tips and information for getting the most out of your fishing as the season progresses. But for our latest episode, we're continuing our fly fishing book club, and this time we speak to Dan O'Donovan, the author of Salmon of the River Lee, as well as a monograph on Sidney Spencer. Now, Dan's book on the Lee is a fascinating social and cultural insight into the communities around Cork's famous river. And we delve into the heyday of the Lee before its damming in 1957 and the effects that has had on the fishing, the people, and the subsequent decline in fish numbers as well. But first, Tom, I have to say, when I bought the book recently, I was pleasantly surprised with the information and various insights from anglers that were included in it. And there's so much information to learn from the book itself.
Yeah, Dara. How's it going? No, well, like all in all, it's a fascinating publication anyway. But as you say there, the insights from the other anglers really lend to it because it's kind of nice that way. A river is special to people, and a river means different things to different guys, and that comes across when you see different anglers talking about it. And that was just one aspect of it. I mean, I have to say I was blown away by the book when I looked at it. I mean, just the pictures alone will keep you occupied. And we discussed one of them there. And if you ever get a chance to see the one of them, the confiscated salmon haul by the poachers. I mean, wow, what do you think of that?
That's mind-blowing. So it's page 28, 29 in the book, and it's a beautiful picture from the Examiner archives, like the quality of the picture. But like, what is it? I think there's a dozen bailiffs or whatever.
Although, in their, you were saying that some of them might have been guards. I presume they were bailiffs, but then I'm talking to him that there was a chance that they might have been guards as well.
But I thought was really interesting was, as Dan explains, is how the early years post Free State that they were trying to nip the poaching in the bud, this kind of lawlessness, this kind of Wild West kind of, because they were trying to develop the tourism side. They wanted the anglers back visiting, and obviously it's hard to. Ireland had gone through such tumult and revolution and war in the years that, obviously a lot of the English anglers who would have come to Ireland, and even Dublin anglers, I presume, are you going to be going down to Cork or Kerry thinking, you could be getting shot at, like.
Without delving too much into it, but I presume there could have been a portion, let's say, of people who were poachers who would have thought, now with the Free State, we are perfectly entitled to take salmon as any way we feel like, because it's a change of government. Whereas, we as anglers would say no, regardless of, it's the Free State government now, but we want to manage this. We want to have it for anglers. We want to have it as not a utility, an amenity or whatever, and also a means of making proper money.
Exactly. And the other thing better as well is, the country was so poor at that time as well. And, and then you had, like, I'm just looking at that photo, it was 1927. So we were only a couple of years into the Free State, and it was also then, as interesting as in the bibliography in Dan's was that, and I'd forgotten about it, was that the Free State, the Angler's Guide, or the Free State Guide to Angling. Again, so they were trying to develop these publications like guides for people to say, look here, if you want to come fishing, here's where you can come.
They really did, didn't they? They put an effort into it,
really pushing it.
I have the 1948 copy of that, actually.
No way.
Yeah, I do, actually, the Angler's Guide. It was compiled by the Department of Agriculture Fisheries branch in Dublin. That's who published it. It's a hardbound copy. It's a fantastic book. But as you say, they really did push it, didn't they?
Yeah, no, they were trying to get on their feet and try and get control of it. Like, it was, I have to say those, and fair play to Dan for doing this, because I think it started off, he's saying the initial, they asked him what do you do, I think it was the history of the club. And he was like, I've no interest in that, but I want to do it. Fair play to him.
Well, he's right too. That would have just, I'm not saying anything to the lads of the club, but that would have only been of interest to most of the guys in the club and a few people outside. But the Lee is, it's nationwide and beyond.
Yeah.
And, really it is.
And he delved into it, like, I was fascinated by the 1800s, a lot of information, a lot of research on it, the kind of, what the catches were like, what the kind of, even he's talking about a closed season in 1842 being welcomed by anglers. I have to be careful. I'm not into history and you're big into this side as well. I talk all day about this stuff. Like, yeah, exactly. The fly fishing history podcast. There'd be a niche now.
Yeah. Oh, they'll be crawling at the door.
That's another. I see another spin-off coming.
Yeah, right. Us and four others.
Yeah, exactly. Although I have to say though, Andrew Hurd, he'd be the man to, you just have him on every week and just listen to him talk about fly fishing history, like, you know.
And you know what? We just sit back, ask the odd question.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think I was very impressed with that. Was his research into the naming of the pools and the old Irish names, because I like that as well. Because I'm fascinated by Irish names around here as well, and where they come from. So I mean, there was so many things to take. There are so many things to take from it. You know,
it is. No, it is. Fair play to Dan, and we do hope to speak to Dan again later in the year, because he also wrote a monograph about Sidney Spencer, who wrote quite a bit about fishing in Donegal, I believe. So we'll speak to Dan later in the year about that. But look, let's first hear from Dan about his book, The Salmon of the River Lee. And he first explained to me the background to the Lee's reputation.
The Lee was a very, very famous salmon river up to the commissioning of the dams in 1957. And even in Cork, up to the time of writing the book, that knowledge was largely lost, I would say. And people elsewhere around the country wouldn't have regarded the Lee as a serious salmon river. But the reality is that prior to the dams, the Lee had a very envied reputation of being a very early spring river with a large run of spring salmon, the order of 10, 11 pounds on average, with some much larger than that. And apart from the spring fish, it had a run of salmon every month of the year. Now, there's a few rivers can boast that, but many, of course, are just summer rivers, maybe autumn rivers. So those that can have salmon 12 months of the year are something pretty special. And as a consequence of having an early spring run, it used to bring a lot of well-to-do visitors back in the 19th century and in the years prior to the dam. And those people would come from around Ireland, but quite a lot would come from across the water. And they fished the Lee in February, March, April, up to May. Now, also part of the Lee's history is the difficulty that the salmon have in getting into the freshwater river where it meets the tide at Cork City in times of low or drought flow. There's a collection of weirs there, complicated by the fact that at the top of the tide, the Lee splits and goes around an island which makes up the centre of Cork City. So if the water is dead low, as it would be very often in the summer, there's no fresh fish up the river. And as a consequence, you didn't have the visitors coming so much at that time of the year. The river was also famous for the amount of poaching that went on a tremendous scale, down in Cork Harbour, which is very large, with drift nets and draft nets and stake nets, up in the city with nets, plus legalised trapping in both channels of the river, stroke hauling, netting. And when you got up into the freshwater, up to the mid-19th century, you had netting way up, not so far from the headwaters. And of course, you had the famous spurge poisoning and sometimes lime poisoning. So I'm after giving enough there to say it was a mystery to me how so many fish kept coming in voluminous numbers. But they did, I suppose, testimony to the quality of the spawning tributaries and the quality of the water that was there in those days. So we had a club anniversary, our club being the Cork Salmon Anglers, of which I'm a member, and we had an important club anniversary coming up, and we wanted to do something to mark that occasion. And some guy came up with the idea of Dan writing a history of the club. And I said, I couldn't be bothered. I said, that would be a dreary old dirge of a tome altogether. But I said, I was much more interested in writing a history of the river, so that people, when all of us here are long dead and gone, would pick up the book. and see what the river once was and see how it deteriorated, why it deteriorated, and see what it is today. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, because the Lee today still ranks in terms of its catch records, as evidenced by the wild salmon and sea trout statistics report that issues every year. It's one of the top rivers in the country. Its catches are always in the top 10. That's notwithstanding that there is still a considerable draft net fishery in the mouth of the river. So that's the background to the writing of the book. So no, I didn't write it all on my own. As you'll have seen from glancing through the book, members were invited to write a little story of what the Lee meant for them, etc. Some read for their whatever, and quite a few did. And I also got considerable help from the editor of the book, Jack Power. Now, Jack was a master with words. It was his profession. He was in your line of business, Dara. And he worked for the Irish Examiner at the time, so he'd be able to get access to some of the old photographs. Now, if you've seen the book, or any of your listeners have seen the book, they'll see that on about page 28, 29, there's a centerpiece photograph there. Now, that was a picture taken in 1927. There's almost 200 fish there. I tried to count them. And the extraordinary thing about that photograph isn't the volume of fish that's there. It's when the photograph was taken. That photograph was taken in the middle of January 1927. And more than any of my words, that proves the early run of springfish to the Lee. Indeed, that run used to start. So the old anglers used to tell me, who'd remember the river pre-dams when I was a young fellow, started fishing first in the mid-1960s. That run would start towards the end of November normally, but would get under pace at a reasonable rate in December, pick up in January, February, March, and indeed in April, in the old days, would start to taper off. And when I was researching the book, I spent lots of time in places like the IFI offices in Macroom, accessing the old minutes book of the Cork Board of Conservators of the Lee. And I was able to verify that about those early runs and the level of poaching that would go on, up to Christmas and that sort of thing. And I came across several records similar to the fish in those photographs. There's another one springs to mind of 140 fish that I came across. Another man being prosecuted for having something like 97 salmon or something at that time of the year, all spring fish. So I thought it was important to get that down and let it be on record.
To say that photo, Dan, that photo is incredible. I'd recommend for anybody to check it out. It's on page 28, 29. It's if I could even try and describe it, it's about a dozen. Is it Gardaí playing? They're dressed in.
Gardaí. I think they were supposedly detectives, but I imagine that there were a few of them. Could have been. They were called bailiffs at the time. The equivalent to today's IFI officers.
They're dressed in suit and ties, and they're sitting there either crossed-armed, but basically in front of them is the 90% of the fish just lying there, and then there's a couple of them hanging behind them on a gate, and it's taken outdoors. It's an incredible picture because the salmon are 3-4 deep, stretching for probably 20 feet. In a kind of an arc in front of them, like it's
up against that.
It's just mind blowing to see it, and to give you some, like you said, to give you some idea. Do you know what my thought when I saw that as well? Because I was looking at the pictures of the bailiffs. What happened to the fish afterwards?
I thought that too.
Well, they would have been sold, and I would have seen references to that in the old conservators' minutes books of these fish being sold. And interestingly enough, I came across in I think it was the Marine Institute Library in Oranmore. I spent 2 days inside in that place. Over the years, there were various commissions of inspection, inquiry into various states of play and rivers, and the kind of thing that came up that struck me, that I'd often thought of myself. It was only when I got into some of these reports I realised why. The Lee has always opened on the 1st of February, and it was a mystery to me why it didn't open, say, like the Liffey on the 1st of January or the Drawes and that. And the reason was very clear. When it opened on the 1st of February, it's opened on the 1st of February. And the Board of Conservators held a majority over, the anglers held a majority over the netsmen, usually by one of a majority. And there were constant and ongoing requests for decades from the legal netsmen to bring the season forward to the 15th of January or the 1st of January. And the rods took the view that, look, keep the nets off the river and let the fresh water get stocked before the nets come out. So that's why on opening day on the 1st of February, there would be quite a few fish in the river. And it wasn't unusual on opening day to have coloured fish, because they could have run 1st of February, they could have run 2 months ago. And I came across, in the course of my research, a diary of a lady called Violet Fane, who came to fish the Lee for 6 weeks from the 1st of February to mid-March 1914, largely fishing with fly. And she fished some very good water that's, for the most part, is Ortov has it today, the Orchard Hole and the Kennel Stream. They'd be still very good waters today. And Violet, in her 45 days of fishing, she fished through all conditions of weather, yellow floods, snow, ice, you name it, she had it. She caught 45 fish. She had 45 days fishing, and to her own rod, she had 21 salmon that weighed 265 pounds. That's a fair old average. Her best fish was 22 pounds. But on the first day of the February, for her, the 2nd, she had 2 fish, and both were slightly coloured spring fish. And she wondered, first of all, were they fish that hadn't spawned on it, until it was told her by some of the local people, saying to her that this was normal enough. The fish ran so early that they had taken some colour by the start of the season.
Amazing. Can I ask you, Dan, as well, and I had actually forgotten about this publication because it was in your bibliography, The Angler's Guide to the Irish Free State.
Oh, yes.
And so basically, because I just want to quickly talk about that one. I think that was in the late 20s, was it, that it was first published? But the whole idea behind it was basically they wanted to kind of clamp down on the poaching and basically encourage the tourism side of angling once more post-Civil War. Is that right?
You'd have to say that our founding fathers, Collins et al., they were more than gunmen. And the Civil War here ended, I think, around May 1923, when hostilities effectively ceased. In 1924 and 1925, there were 2 fishery acts brought out that were very, very far-reaching. They gave fishery officers the power, far stronger powers than they used to have. They could stop and inspect your horse and car or your motor car, or if they had reasonable grounds, they could come in and inspect your house. It also extended the powers to the new Garda Síochána to search and become involved in fisheries, because the powers that be realised they had to get the economy moving and had to take advantage of everything. That's one of the reasons why they started the Shannon scheme as well, to generate electricity to cover basically the country's needs. But they needed the external income that the UK visitors brought. Now, remember as well that fishing in Ireland would be reported in the two main fishing magazines stroke newspapers. That would be the Fishing Gazette, which was a weekly publication, and the Field magazine. And you had rivers like the Lee, the Shannon, the Blackwater, the Moy. The main rivers would be reported every week in those newspapers. So the better the catches that were shown in those, the better for tourism. There was also a number of books written. That guide that you described would be the kind of guide that it wouldn't be unlike the tourist guides you'd have today, would tell you where to go and when and what to expect and where to stay, and gave a little bit more than there was another guide at the time that was there since around 1860, 1870. The name of it isn't coming to me now, but it's far more detailed than that about the rivers. And that was commissioned by the Free State government. But there were a number of other books written as well. There's a chap comes to mind, Captain Bertie Drought, who wrote a fishing and shooting book. And then there's a book written by a man, I refer to him in the book there, Singh is his name, Singe, I think, off the top of my head. And that book, both those books, I suspect that they were commissioned to perhaps write those books because they were telling how much improved things were. And after the Civil War, the British tourist was afraid of his life to come to Ireland. They expected that the fishing would go down the tubes, by the way. But much to their surprise, with proper policing, it really started to improve no end. And that brought the visitors in because they seemed to worry less about getting shot the more they heard about good fishing. So I suppose that's something resonates with us all. The more we hear about fish being caught, the more the urge takes us to get out and get a part of the action ourselves.
Tell me this, Dan. Might just take it up to then the fall, because you've painted a very good picture of how good the run was throughout the season on the river and how popular. But really, talk us through the damming of it and the consequences of that, and maybe just give us the kind of context for the rationale behind the damming.
Well, the rationale is pretty straightforward. I mentioned earlier about the Shannon scheme. Ireland had, lots of towns all around the country, even cities, were relying for electricity on a few private suppliers. There was no consistency. All the rural areas had no electricity at all. So when the British ruled here, they had been looking from the 19th century at damming the Shannon for generating electricity. But the Free State government took it in earnest, and Siemens came on board. And when that came into commission in the late 1920s, that effectively produced as much electricity as the country needed. But quickly, the state found as it started to develop that it needed more. And you had the Earn scheme, and you had the Liffey, I think, and the Lee. I think the Lee was the fourth major scheme. And initial planning on that started in the 40s, and work got underway about 1952 or thereabouts, and those dams were commissioned in 1957. It had a dramatic impact on the river. Now, the Lee is something over 50 miles long, and effectively the best of the salmon fishing was between Cork City and Macroom, which is roughly about 20 miles. And the lower dam at Inniscarra, that was constructed 8 miles above the tide. And it was, from the very outset, it was a disaster for firstly, the best of the fly fishing water was above the dam. Some famous beats like the Fargus comes to mind instantly. Captain Drought mentioned that in one of his books as for the favoured few. The dam then at Inniscarra, it ranks in the status of world dams as a very high dam. It's by far the highest in the country depending on which set of ESB statistics you look at, it's either 140 or 150 feet high. And if you stand at the top of it, as I have a few times, and you look at how the fish are supposed to get up, and they can get up at the Lee Dam, that's not a difficulty, but where the difficulty is in the smolts getting down. Now, in the early days of the dams being commissioned, the smolts were unable to find access to the fish pass. When that was corrected in the mid-1960s, the smolts were able to get into the pass, but there's a serious question mark as to what percentage of them survived the fall of well over 100 feet before they hit the water below. There's no great science as to how they come down. They come tumbling down in a column of water. So there's things like impact, pressure, turbulence. When I say pressure, I'm talking about water pressure and changes therein that can damage a smolt. And a smolt is a very, very vulnerable creature when he goes downriver and when he hits the salt. So a smolt, for example, I discovered from different pieces of research, he could have a damage coming through a dam, and that might not manifest itself below the dam, but when he'd hit, say, salt water, he could, from his injuries that he might be carrying, the stress of a healthy smolt hitting the salt water can impact on him. But if there's any damage at all, it can end in fatality. That was one immediate consequence. Another was the rate at which they filled the dams, the reservoirs in the two dams on the Lee. They filled them quite quickly, apparently. And the impact of that was the rotting vegetation took the dissolved oxygen content out of the water. So that when they started to generate, say, through in Ascara, the lower dam, the water, people must understand, the water into the turbines, it comes into the intakes, the penstock intakes, not from the top of the dam, but from well below the top of the dam. And that water has even less oxygen in it there. So when that deoxygenated water went down the river, any fish that were below couldn't breathe. And it killed, it didn't wipe out the run totally, but it killed salmon in their thousands. And that's covered in the minutes again. And when I was a young lad fishing, I often had the old anglers talking about it. You had everyone in Cork who had any association to the river, whether they were living near it or whether they were anglers. They'd walk the banks to pick out the salmon that had died from oxygen every time there'd be a rise and fall of the water. The fish would be perfect, and they were sold on. There's no statistical record of how many salmon were killed from lack of oxygen. But what we do know is in the first 3 years of the dam, 1957, 58 and 59, there's just about 3,000 fish a year survived to go through the dam pass on their way upstream, and they were counted. Now, we know the smolts weren't coming down. In 1960, the figures going through the dam was 803, and in 1961, that fell to 163 fish. Now, you must remember...
That's an amazing drop. So you're talking from when the dam was in at first, Dan, 3,000 down to a figure of about 100?
Yeah, 163.
In a period of what, 5 or 6 years?
4 years, 4 or 5 years.
4 years.
4 or 5 years, yeah.
Wow. Dan, sorry now, I just want to cut back now because we're there, but just the thing I wanted to ask you, was there any opposition to the dam at the time?
There was, but limited. And in their heart of hearts, people knew that it was progress. It had to be done. And it had been, there were precedents for it. The Earn scheme, like Bagnall is the Lee, is it left 8 miles of water. The Earn, the bottom dam, is there at Ballyshannon, isn't it? And yeah, like that river is devastated, absolutely devastated. The Shannon, my goodness, I've written a book about the Lee, but wouldn't we all love if someone had written a book about the glory days of the fishing at Castleconnell and the various fisheries that were there? the snippets that you'll get in angling books. I have an extract someplace of a piece written by a guy called John Rennie, Rennie, and Battles with Giants. There's a marvellous account in Fred Buller's book of the giant fish, the giant salmon, volume 2, of a man, is he MacDonald is his name, getting a fish of something over 50 pounds at Dunas. It would bring a tear to your eye to listen to it.
Alas, no more.
Alas, no more, unfortunately. Well, you say that, but if anglers are anything, we're optimists. And we have to look at the wider world. And there are a lot of dams coming down in America, and there's dams coming down in France. So who's to know that someday there won't be a dam or two come down in Ireland? I can't say, but it mightn't happen in my time, but who knows?
We'll need a lot more wind turbines out in the ocean, I think.
Actually, well, that's a question. Do you know, and we'll go, you mightn't be able to answer this, but what amount of electricity Inniscarra Dam produces now compared to number of wind turbines?
I've seen a number of figures. It is well below 1% of the country's electricity that it produces at the moment. I've heard someone saying it's below 0.2%. But times have moved on, and they've moved on for Inniscarra as well too, because the city of Cork is now drawing water from the reservoirs at Inniscarra to Ringaskiddy in Cork Harbour, where all the chemical companies are, and to various industry and for private residential supply. So it now has a secondary purpose that it didn't have before, which makes it unlikely that the dam will come down anytime soon. Even before the collapse, the ESB anticipated what would happen in the late 1950s, and they built a hatchery at Carrigadruhid, which is where the upper dam is, and they put a hatchery there for raising fry, which they released into the 73% of the catchment area, which is above Inniscarra. And they found that was useless because they weren't successfully going down through the dam. So in 1968, that hatchery became a smolt rearing facility. And from 1968 on, they started releasing smolts below Inniscarra Dam. In other words, ranching smolts. And for example, last year, being March 22, there were 70,000 smolts released in the Lower Lee. And this year, there will be 65,000 released. But the return of hatchery smolts back to the river is only a fraction of what the return of the wild smolts are. And for example, the last to the Lee is the spring run. We're getting practically no hatchery fin clip smolts in our spring catches. We are getting them in the grilse catches in the summer, and our observations through the club and wider I know from talking to some of the IFI fishery officers who would observe some of the catches with the draft nets in Cork Harbour, there's about 1 in 5 of our grilse are hatchery origin. So the bulk of the rest of them are coming from 2 tributaries below the dam, the Bride, which is by far the most important tributary, and also the Shornock. I'm convinced that there is some percentage still going through the dam because there are quite a number of salmon who do not have a clip adipose fin. In other words, indicating wild origin. There's quite a few of those still going through the dam. Now, the average number of salmon which goes through the dam each year through Inniscarra Dam, where there's a counter, it's about 500. I have the figures there. You'll see them towards the end of the book, Dara, of what has gone through since 1957.
I've seen that, but that's a raise now from, let's say, 1961, but it actually went down to 100. So it is.
Yeah.
after 60 years, it has made its way back up to 500. But when you consider it was originally 3,000, still.
Well, the 3,000 is a very, very low estimate. That's 3,000 when God knows how many of them were poisoned. Well, not poisoned, but were died from deoxygenation below the dam. And the thing about the 500 that is there at the minute, quite a lot of those that are going through are homing back to the cargo hatchery that they came out. But there are wild fish going through, because when they trap for the hatchery, they get a percentage of them. And we do know from the monthly stats of the salmon going through the dam in the early months of the year, we do know there are fish going upstream then, whereas the rod catches downstream in the spring months are no longer reflecting fin-clipped fish. They were many years ago, and there's lots of differences for that I'd be half the night telling you about. But the fact that wild fish are going through the dam, numbers in the earlier months of the year, suggests to me they can't all be strays. There must be some wild spawn still going on in the dam, and some of them are getting down, probably with massive devastation as they come through either the turbines or down the fish pass. There are three ways smolts can come through the dam, either of the two turbines. One turbine was never tested for mortality. That's the big turbine. The small turbine, which that was tested in the mid-60s by the IFI of the day, and the scientists there found that the smolts that came through that turbine, which was a comparatively small percentage of the total run of smolts, they were either dead or none would survive. And I have that report. I managed to unearth that report. So there's some few, I think, coming down, and I would love to see research done that would improve things.
Now that there have been so many dams worldwide, have there been any successful methods in getting smolts to use the fish pass, or any places where they improve the mortality, or should we say lessen the mortality rate of smolts running down? And if they did, how did they do it?
The answer to your question is yes. But when you talk of a dam, the first thing you must understand is a dam is like a person, like a picture, like a fine summer's day. Every single one of them is different. Height, volume of water, pressure, all kinds of things. A critical thing, for example, is the turbines, the turning of the blades, how fast they turn. At Inniscarra, the small turbine, it revolves at a hugely high rate. And one scientist said to me many years ago, he said anything coming down there would be mincemeat. And that was the findings of that report I found in 1965. The bigger turning turbine next to it, that turns at a much slower rate. And there was some possibility, one scientist said to me, that some of the smolts coming through there may survive. Now, the big issue I would have with the Inniscarra Dam is the fish pass there, is the smolts that do come into the top chamber, when they topple down, they're in free fall down. I could best describe it as a lift shaft. It's not quite vertical, but it's not far off it. And they're contained within the column of water. Now, I could bore you with research, but I won't, and just tell you that a smolt falling in a column of water is a high risk of damage after he falls 13 meters. And in the lee, they're falling well in excess of 30 meters. So the only scientific report I could find on such a pass is that serious damage would be done. Now, past that, go to the upper dam at Carrigadrut, which is much smaller. The turbine revolves at a lower rate, and the smolts are able to go up, are able to come down through there without devastation. A small number may be killed, or a small percentage, but you have other dams around the country where it can pass through, and I have found some research proving that. We know in America, are there other ways of being done? The old thing, truck and trailer is a big one in America in some of the huge dams. In other words, the smolts are trapped in their intake, and they're diverted into tanks, and there's so many of them inside there. They start up the lorry and they bring them stream. Often they may have to go downstream on some of the big rivers, past 4, 5, 6, 7 dams to release them maybe hundreds of miles downstream, where they're below, where they can be damaged by turbines, etc., and let them off. But that's very costly and requires an awful lot of manpower. And let's put it frankly here, the ESB, who has the responsibility for the dams here, I don't believe they have any stomach for spending that kind of money.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Where there's a will, there's a way, Tom.
Tell me this, Dan. Some amount of what I love about this book is, and in terms of also the kind of input from the anglers, just talking about their own memories and, and like when you pick up the book, it's a real kind of social and cultural kind of history involved in the river. Which I enjoyed about it. Like you said, it wasn't just a club history. It gave you the kind of like the overarching history of it. I was one of the contributions from Diarmuid Williams. I thought some lovely descriptions there, and I'm just going to read a bit out for it. There could be no doubt that prior to the 1950s damming, the Lee coursed through its valleys and pastures with a rare splendor, serenity, and fertility. It was the organic lifeblood of countless communities and small holdings, richly feeding their way of life, customs, families, and livelihoods along its meandering way. The river evoked the changing seasons, constantly bringing fresh promise of nature's bountiful harvest to bolster human endeavour and to enrich lives. In epitomizing as it does such comforts to the soul, how sorrowful is it that, like the mayfly, our sojourn by life's river is so short. I think it's brilliant. Beautiful writing. But it gives you a real sense of kind of what it meant and the valley of it. Like, tell me this, Dan, what's the fishing like on it nowadays? Is there many people fishing it in terms of, members of the angling clubs?
Yeah. The one thing that seems to have changed in recent years is members, they seem to come into the clubs and leave the clubs now more rapidly than was the case before. With a city like Cork and the broader area, something like 200,000 people, there's not a lot of places on 8 miles of water, 5 miles of it being kind of worthwhile. So there were always waiting lists for the club, and people would say it was closed shop, etc., etc. That wasn't the case, and it certainly wasn't for people with bigger checkbooks than others. Our club has always prided itself on having members across all walks of life, from doctors to dockers and everything else in between. And that is still the case. And I think that's a great sign of a club to have a healthy mix of people there. I'll just rattle out some stats for you to answer that. In 2020, the rods on the Lee returned a total of 591 fish caught. 85 of those fish were reported as retained. Now, that put the Lee as the eighth best angling river by numbers in the country. The nets on top of that took 759 fish, and that's a total of 1,350 fish caught on the river. In 2021, the total was 902 by the rods, 86 retained, and it was the 6th highest rod catch in Ireland. The nets took 539. Now, the Lee is a brown tag river, and there was a recent draw, and there was something over 200 anglers applied for a brown tag. Now, the reality is there's probably 300 or 400 anglers that would fish the river between the free water and the club. And there's some very useful free water inside, right at the top of the tide at Cork City Waterworks. There's a lot of fish caught there every summer, because if there isn't water coming down the main river sufficient for them to run upstream, they hold up and lodge there, and they get caught in good numbers. And the great thing to see, very much like the lakes, Tom, the amount of fish that are being put back now, it's terrific. It's marvellous to see. And I know catch and release has its critics and that, but I've never seen a dead salmon got a bang in the head. I've never seen one of them breach the spawning beds. The fellow who's
definitely won't. No.
Yeah, the fellow who's released to fight another day, he will make his way upstream, and there's going to be a very significant portion of those that spawn to survive, and not so much survive, but to regenerate.
Tell me this, Dan, is there many brown trout anglers on the river?
Yeah, and brown trout fishing is quite good. And again, the catch and release on that is terrific. Our club now, we have some anglers who fish solely for brown trout, not a huge number, but mostly it's summer evenings and that. And I'm not sure how it was last year. I didn't hear too many of them talking about it, but I know in recent years it has been very good. Fellas getting, some of them 5-6 trout, some of the really good lads on the right evenings getting 15-20 trout on mixture of dry fly and wet fly and that. And virtually all of those fish are released, which I think is marvellous.
That's really good. What's the stamp of the trout in it, Dan? What half pound, 3/4 of a pound? I haven't fished for trout on the lead, Tom, since I was a kid. And if you got a half-pound trout, you'd be pleased. When we'd be fishing in the spring there now with our pheasant tail nymph with a deadly fly, 6-7 ounces was the kind of go of it. But there are much bigger trout there, and there were always bigger trout in it, up to several pounds weight. I know one angler got a trout there, must be 5 or 6 years ago now, and he was over 8 pounds weight, and he was got in a dry sedge in the summer's evening. I saw a picture of that trout, and there's no doubt as to what he weighed.
Dan, can I ask you just last few questions? It's fascinating listening to you, some amount of detail and depth of information that you have. Was there anything that surprised you during your research and writing of the book?
I was surprised when I knocked on doors that the dogs weren't set on me in a few places. I was really surprised at, you mentioned Williams there now, several people like him. I didn't know Dermot Williams from Adam, and Dermot his father was a doctor born out in Macroom of the famous Williams family who had Williams Hotel. Now that was a fishing hotel where fellas would come year in, year out, and they at least, the river up there had some very good water. And all the Williams lads were great anglers. One of the old anglers in the club, he told me that there was this man who had a holiday home in Waterville, and that if I could get his number, he had some interesting tales to tell of the old river. So I got onto somebody else who got onto somebody in Waterville who got a number for this man in the UK, and I rang him. Well, the delight that Dermot had that we should be interested in writing this book. Like, Dermot was born in the UK, but he knew all about the river from his father, and I'm not sure if he was old enough or if he was around when his grandfather was there, but he couldn't do enough. He searched the country getting photographs for me. He sent me an old tape recording when his dad was 80 years of age in 1979. He sat him down and he asked him to name the pools in the Upper Lee. And he rattled off, quicker than I could talk, 50 pools. And when I was doing my own research afterwards, I was able to cross-section or to cross-reference those pools, and they were all barring one. I have a question mark over the one. They were all spot on. Any of those I could verify. And he had them all in the right order. And that's just a small example of the kind of trouble that man took. There was another man as well that I never met, but I met him after the book was published. His name was John. I can't think of his surname at the moment now. And someone gave me his number and said, try this fella. And John went knocking on doors. He was from back that country, living in the city. He went back that way. He went knocking on doors, left, right and centre, and he came up with some marvellous contacts. And his contribution was very important to what I call the drowned river, the waters above the dams. Well,
it's you did incredible service and work documenting it, Dan, and putting it together. And I think it's, like I said, it's something for a historical record as well to have. Before we let you go, Dan, final question we always ask our guests is, what was your most memorable fish on the fly? And was it on the River Lee?
Yeah, that's the big question.
No, in fact. But I knew you'd ask me that, and I'm going to give you 3 ones very quickly. But before I do so, if any of your listeners are interested in getting this book, Salmon of the River Lee, the only place they will get it is with Cocky Bandu Books in Wales.
That's anglebooks.com.
They have very few copies left. I spoke with Paul Morgan, at the proprietor at Christmas time. He said they have about 6 or 7 left. And there won't be a rerun, a reprint, not by me anyway. But to come back to your question about the fish, I have a very memorable fish from the Lee, which was a trout about 9 or 10 ounces. It taught me a very salutary lesson when I was about 14 years of age. I was trout fishing, saw this trout rise across from me, covered him, got him, landed him. And when I did, he had nylon on him. And when I examined him, I found some careless angler had thrown a lump of strong nylon, 15, 16 pounds breaking strain, into the river. And there was a closed, non-running loop in it. And by some miracle, it passed over the trout's head and had stopped in front of his dorsal and underneath him, in front of the middle section fins. And as the trout grew, the nylon cut in over his back and through his belly. So he had a complete loop of nylon outside him and 4, I suppose you could call them stigmata, 2 up on either side of his back and 2 below. And he was doing perfectly well. I never forgot that lesson. It's worth passing on now, so no one would be tempted to leave nylon on the bank. And if you see someone else's nylon, pick the bloody thing up. The next rise I'll tell you about is the sea trout, the next fish. In the Hebrides one time, I got a big sea trout, 6.5 to 7 pounds weight. And it was the rise that made it so special. He jumped out of the water for not less than 6 feet away from the flies, totally cleared the water, came down on top of the top dropper and took it on the way in. I had never seen a rise as spectacular as that before. But the gillie who was with me assured me that he had, and it's only a very big trout you would see do it. Now, I have seen other very large trout. I have seen 2 or 3 others do something similar, but not as spectacular, clearly, completely out of the water, down. No accident. He was going for that fly. How he managed it, I don't know. And the other fish I remember, fishing below in Killarney in Loch Lane, Tom, I know you'll have fished it a few times. Right. Fishing for half pounders, a place called Benson's Pond, which is a good salmon lie. And going down there one day, with my little 9-foot fiberglass rod, 20th of July 1985, and seeing this lobe of a tail come up, over, dorsal appeared then, down on my flies, and I knew he was a good one. And you're supposed to wait till you feel him. I waited, he disappeared, and I said, bugger this, I lifted, and I had him. And an hour and a quarter later, we got him in the boat, and he was 17 pounds weight, 5-pound cast. And he's my most memorable salmon on the fly.
Some fish, I was going to say trout. That's phenomenal. 17 pound plus. 17
pounds spot on. He resides on Glass Case now, Tom.
Yeah.
Fair play.
Wow.
Fair play. Some stories. Dan O'Donovan, it's been brilliant chatting to you. I think we'll get you on because we wanted to chat to you also about your monograph on Sidney Spencer. We didn't get a chance to it.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about the Hebrides, I know you've fished, a lot of places. So I think we'll definitely get you on if you come on again, and we'll chat on about your other fishing stories. There seems to be plenty there.
If you'll put up with me, maybe.
Well, actually.
Maybe if you keep that promise to Tom to come up for the mayfly, I could tell a few yarns inside around loughs. How would you think of that, Tom?
Oh, no problem. They're not yarns. No, come on. They're stories. They're credible stories. I won't hear them called yarns.
Can I just leave it? So Dan O'Donovan, Salmon of the River Lee is the name of the book. It's go to anglebooks.com. To get your last few copies. I think there's only 5 now left, Dan, because I got one a couple of days ago, so there's only five left. I do want to finish with, and I love this quote that's on the inside jacket cover to sum up the Lee. And it says, I am lucky in having a friend who has some fishing on the Lee. I stayed about 10 days at the hut in April 1927, and never, except in Newfoundland, have I seen so many salmon. At a modest estimate, some of the pools, which were all small, must have held between 300 and 400 fish. And that's J.W. Sane from Irish Bogs, 1928. Just to give you some idea, isn't it? Like what it must have been like. Dan O'Donovan, thanks again for joining us on the show.
If I could have one last word, Dara.
Of course.
What has happened to the Lee, we should never let anything like that happen to the great jewels we have left. The likes of Mask and the likes of Cork. And one little irritant I have at times is anglers moaning. Moan all right, but for goodness sake, when something needs dealing with, moan to the right people and in the right place.
Here. Well said, Dan. Yeah. Thank you for joining us, and well said.
Our thanks to Dan O'Donovan for joining us on the show. And don't forget to rate, review, and follow the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Plus, you can keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and myself and Tom will be back with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.